I'm Philippa, CEO of Paradigm Norton, and this is Life Matters More, where we explore ESG, sustainability, and the future of business. Hello, and welcome to another episode of Life Matters More. Today, I am joined by Anne Johnstone, ESG Director at Vital Energi. Vital Energi is a company at the sharp end of delivering low-carbon heat at scale through heat networks, large heat pumps, and long-term energy infrastructure. Anne has spent more than 2 decades working across sustainability, the built environment, and energy. But what makes her perspective distinctive is that she doesn't just talk about targets. She talks about the more concrete side of sustainability: pipes in the ground, supply chains, skills, governance, and people. She grew up in a former coal mining community, and that experience has shaped her belief that transition to net zero must also be a just transition, one that creates opportunity and not resentment. In this conversation, we're going to talk about why decarbonising heat is so hard, what energy security really means in practice, and how equality, diversity, and inclusion show up or fail to in the UK's energy transition. Anne, welcome.
Thank you, Philippa. Delighted to be here.
Okay, let's dive in with our first question. I'm really looking forward to chatting to you because you are just the most interesting person about heat. But when most people think about net zero, they think about electricity or they think about transport. Why does heat matter so much, and why has it been so easy to ignore?
It matters because it's the invisible giant of the energy system, and heat accounts for almost half of the UK's carbon emissions. So we can't get to net zero without decarbonising heat. But it's been easy to ignore because of the massive success of the gas network. So around 85% of buildings in the UK are connected to the mains gas network, and for decades, that has the supply of gas through those pipes has been heating our homes and buildings, without anybody really having to think too much about it. And that was the case really right up until the Russian invasion of Ukraine, when suddenly people did become aware of it because their energy bills tripled almost overnight. But that was the first time really probably that a lot of people did stop to think about heat, other than the really unfortunate occasions when your boiler maybe broke down in the middle of January and then suddenly you were aware of where your heat did or didn't come from. But we've just got so used to burning gas to heat our homes. And in actual fact, a lot of homes in the UK are massively energy efficient. So we burn lots of gas to heat our entire houses and like a lot of the kind of external atmosphere as well, because around a quarter to a third of the heat, that the gas that we burn to heat our homes, of that heat just goes out through leaky doors and windows and things. So when it's plentiful and you don't have to think about that, then we don't. And that's the way that we've lived essentially since the kind of like the 70s and the 80s. But now we're in a different world, and we have both the climate crisis and the fact that we have to deal with those emissions, but also the energy insecurity and the price of gas affecting people's lives in a very real way.
Yeah, where there's no problem, there's no thinking, I think is the right way of looking at it. So when you talk about decarbonising heat, what are we actually talking about in practice? What are the actual changes on the ground compared to the gas-based system, which is so prevalent?
Yeah. In practice, what we're talking about is moving from burning fossil fuels to an electrified system, and that electricity coming from renewables. That's what we mean by decarbonising heat. And there's really sort of 3 main pathways to doing that. So the first one is buildings having individual heat pumps. So that's where you, instead of having a gas boiler, you have a heat pump and that heat pump takes heat from either air from the outdoors, the environment, or potentially from underground. So whether it's an air source or a ground source heat pump, and it acts a bit like a reverse fridge. So it takes a small amount of heat from a big reservoir, compresses it, and then uses that to heat hot water, which then gets circulated around your house and provides you with heating and hot water. Or you connect to a heat network, which is essentially a big version of that. So instead of each building having its own individual heat pump, you have an energy centre which has large industrial size heat pumps in it, and that's where you create the heat, and then it's distributed through a pipe network to lots of buildings that are connected. And the third way is to use hydrogen, which in my view is not really feasible. So although there's a lot of noise around that, but I personally don't think that hydrogen has any role really in domestic heating. So the kind of change for consumers is actually very little. In reality, when either you have a heat pump outside rather than a boiler inside, or if you're connected to a heat network, you have something called a heat interface unit, which is smaller than a domestic condensing boiler, and it just sort of like sits there in a cupboard, and that is what controls the hot water going around your house. But the more visible change is the change in infrastructure. So gas is at the moment obviously distributed through underground pipes, and for heat networks, instead of that, we would have pipes that are distributing water. So that means digging up roads and lots of kind of civils work and infrastructure. So to completely, as I sort of said before, to move from having 85% of the country on a gas network to, even 20 to 30% of it on district heat networks is going to involve a lot of that kind of civils work and disruption. But once the pipes are in the ground, they're in the ground, and the impact on consumers is actually very little.
And is that why there's been relatively small amount of take up? What's getting in the way? I mean, it feels to me like having a heat network where there is a waste heat or waste energy, and that is then used to keep humans warm, or keep theatres warm, or council houses warm. That just seems like a really obvious solution. Mm-hmm. So why isn't it happening?
There's a number of different reasons, but the main one is really blockers that come from our regulatory and market framework. So we've built a market around buildings having individual gas boilers, and all of our pricing rules and consumer protections and planning legislation is all kind of like built around that, and none of it is really designed for shared heat infrastructure. So heat ends up kind of sitting in the middle. The reason I called it the invisible giant is that it ends up sitting in this kind of like space between buildings and electricity generation. And those two things get lots of focus, particularly in the UK at the moment. And heat's actually, it seems to get overlooked, but it is actually the bridge between the two things. So we kind of, by thinking about the entire system, including heat, we unlock lots of other things, which we'll probably come on to in a bit. But there are practical issues as well. So I mentioned obviously you have to dig up streets, and until essentially this year, heat networks have not been classified as a utility. So gas and electricity and fibre, although those are all classed as utilities, which means that you get certain rights as a utility undertaker to dig up roads and pavements and put, do repairs or put new infrastructure in. But heat networks, like district heat pipe, hasn't been classed as a utility. So every time you do work, you have to apply for permits, and you have to apply for a different permit for every bit of your network. And that makes it quite slow and expensive. And that has been addressed by legislation, but it's only just coming into force now. So that'll kind of remove that drag. But that's something that has made it more expensive than it really needed to be to put in this kind of infrastructure. that whole aspect of the financing of heat networks is tricky, because there was a lot of government subsidy for the initial rollout of the gas network. And although there is some grant funding available, that level of subsidy doesn't exist for transitioning us off gas and onto district heating. And we also, so without having certainty around things like tariffs and anchor load customers. So an anchor load is a big heat user, something like a hospital, or a university campus, or some user that's going to use a lot of heat and therefore make it economical to invest in it. It's very difficult to kind of attract private investment in without some kind of without that subsidy element, or without some kind of some other sort of market mechanism. And the final thing is the price of electricity in the UK. So electricity prices in the UK are about 4 times the price of gas, and that makes it quite difficult compared to countries like Denmark or the Netherlands, where they've got a longer history of having heat networks, for us to start deploying them at scale here.
Okay, we're all beginners who are listening to you, so I'm going to roll you back a little bit. So We've talked about heat, we've talked about electricity. Why is electricity affecting the cost of heat?
Of gas?
Cost of gas. Where does the heat district get its heat from? Why aren't we pumping electricity? You're gonna have to go back a little bit for us.
Right. I know there's a lot to unpack, so it can seem counterintuitive, but actually, at the moment, so we have there's, without getting into too much detail, essentially, as I said, for every 1 pence per kilowatt hour that you pay for gas in the UK, you pay 4 pence for, and it's not actually 1 and 4 pence, but just to highlight, illustrate, you pay 4 pence for the same unit of electricity that you would for that same amount of energy and gas. And the reason for that is that even though we're building out lots of renewables, offshore wind farms, solar farms, all these kinds of things, and they generate electricity cheaply, the cost of the subsidies that have gone for building those things goes on to electricity, not onto gas. But more importantly, we pay something called the price that we pay for electricity is determined by the fuel of last resort, which is essentially, if you have, if your wind turbines aren't turning or your solar farms aren't generating, and you have to switch on a gas-powered fire station, the cost of that, burning that gas to generate electricity, is what sets the cost of every unit of electricity of gas. So we still pay, the price of electricity is inextricably linked to the price of gas. And until we break that link, then it makes it expensive to electrify heat. Now, what's unfortunate about that is that when you've got a district heat network and you've got the pipes in the ground, the heat can come from anywhere. So what I said, it could come from the air, it could come from underground, it could come from rivers, it could come from sewers, it could come from the tube, it can come from waste heat from industry. So we already do this in some places in the UK, where we burn energy from waste to generate electricity, and there is heat that can come from that process, which can be fed into district heat networks. It can come from data centres, it can come from all sorts of places. So, heat networks are what's described as agnostic. Once the pipes are there, the heat can come from anywhere. So you could build a heat network today that actually has, and this is something that Vital does, we've built heat networks in the past that are actually gas networks. So the heat is produced by what's called a CHP, a combined heat and power engine. And then we've gone back in subsequently and replaced that CHP with heat pumps. And then, in 15, 20 years' time, you might go back and replace it with a more efficient heat pump, or there might be another heat source that becomes available that allows you to extend your network. So it's all cumulative, but the important thing is actually try to get the pipes in the ground in the first place.
And the pipes are delivering hot water.
Mm-hmm.
And then what happens to the hot water?
So the pipes get the heat comes from, as I said, if we take an example, we've got a big, one of our kind of we've got quite a high profile site in Scotland, which is called Queen's Quay, where we have 2 river source heat pumps. So those heat pumps are taking heat out of the River Clyde, and people might think, how can that possibly be? Like, how can it be warm enough?
It's not known for its balmy sort of swimming quality.
But the temperature of the river, the temperature range in the river is generally around sort of like 3 degrees in winter to up to about 15 degrees in summer. But even in winter, that is enough heat within that body of, because it's massive, it's a massive body of water. There is more than enough heat in there for the energy centre that we've built and multiple other energy centres along the river. So what happens is we pump the water out, it goes through the heat pumps, which are large industrial scale heat pumps. And as I said, it's a bit like if you ever, like, you pull your fridge out to clean behind it and you can feel the heat, like from your compressor extracting the heat from your fridge. Essentially, it's the reverse process. So the heat pumps are compressing the heat that comes from that river water and then using it to heat water that gets circulated around highly efficient insulated pipes, which then carry it to the buildings that are connected, where they have something called a plate heat exchanger and a heat interface unit, and that connects that hot water to the building's central heating system, so the radiators, and provides hot water for taps and showers. And that's very basically how it works. And that's, so that, like, don't ask me any more questions on that side of it, because that's me reaching my limit of engineering knowledge.
Do we all have to have our houses the same temperature, or can we adjust it?
Well, see, this is one of the other things about the energy transition. It requires a bit of behavioural change from people as well. So this is what I mean about because we're also used to gas. Like, what people do is they think, I'm a little bit cold, I'm going to turn the thermostat up, and then your boiler kicks in and you're burning all this gas to heat your, and your radiators get really hot, but it takes ages to heat the rest of your house. If you're on a heat network, then essentially the temperature in your house is pretty much constant all the time. But also the system can act, and heat pumps can act as, because they are essentially built on refrigeration technology, they can help cool as well, so they can extract heat as well as deliver it. So they can act as heating and cooling systems. But yes, people do have to get more used to just like having an ambient temperature. But that ambient temperature is comfortable. Like, if you ever go into a house that's on a heat network, it should just feel like, a nice warm temperature. But you don't really need to all the time. Yeah,
I'm looking forward to that future. I don't like the cold, so my house being warm all the time would just be brilliant. All right, so the Vital Energi, what does good look like, other than everyone having lovely warm houses all the time or cooled houses all the time? What does it look like when it works really well from both a technical and a social perspective?
Well, not very much is really the answer. If it's so good to us would look like people just really not really, as you said, they're just not really being aware that you're on a heat network. You've got a nice warm house. You can have a hot shower whenever you want one. You're comfortable. Your bills are affordable and predictable, and it's just not really something that you have to think about. That's that is for us what good looks like. So technically, that's efficient, low carbon generation with a well insulated network, smart controls, and kind of like real resilience in the system from the very first day. But socially, I think good is about people trusting and being able to see the value of it at a local level. And that comes from things like transparent billing, it being affordable, local jobs being created, and having sort of like genuine community involvement. Because heat networks are different to other types of people might be aware of things like community benefit funds that are related to wind farms, but quite often, that, or even if you think about gas power stations, the generation tends to be at some distance from the community that's affected by it, or local to it, or provided by it. But heat networks are inherently within a community. So the energy centre will be somewhere local, that it will be, people will feel that it is connected to them. Like our heat network, one of the biggest heat networks that we operate on behalf of Leeds City Council in Leeds it's called Leeds Pipe. So it's got its own name. It was given that name by school children. It has its own website. You can go on and look, and and I think, and people, that feeling of belonging is actually really important. We want people to, because heat networks, once the infrastructure's there, they're there for generations. So it's not a case of when we're doing that kind of community engagement, obviously, we might only be there in terms of what people can see during the construction phase, but afterwards, it's an asset that belongs in various different ways to that community.
Yeah, I love that. We're so disconnected, aren't we, from where our food comes from and where our energy comes from. So being able to say, oh, my house is heated by that data centre over there feels really nice, actually. So before we dig into kind of the public perception and social costs, etc., so we invested a lot of money into our gas network. We really believed that the gas network was the future. How are we ensuring that we're not designing systems, digging up the roads, laying all the pipes, that locks us into the wrong solution in the future?
Yeah. I think, as I said before, the pipes don't care where the heat comes from. So once they're in the ground, this is one of the other things about heat networks. You can lay pipes now that are relying on one type of technology, but you're not going to be locked into that. So, when we build an energy centre and we put the pipes themselves will have a lifespan of 50, 60 plus years, but heat pumps have got a lifespan at the moment of around 15 to 20 years. So we're not, we're building, so the main thing is you obviously want to get things like where your energy centre is, you want that to be right, the size of it to be right. But the actual technology, we already know that it will change and it will develop and it will improve. And actually, heat networks allow you that flexibility. It's much more flexible because, you've got these energy centres dotted all over the place rather than a big network that's connected to a huge power station. So there's inherent flexibility there that you don't get with the gas network. So there's less risk of being locked into something that that we're kind of saying, well, we don't know whether. And the other thing is that we do know that it works. It's not, none of this is new technology. Like Denmark's had heat networks for 100 years. Like we've had heat networks there are existing like heat, there are actually probably way more heat networks in the UK than people are even aware of. But we've had them for in some places for generations already. So we're not talking about something that's unproven, or we're experimenting on people. We know that this works. We know how to do it. It's just that we haven't really yet done it at scale. But so that it's not really about the technology. The risk isn't on that technology side. It is on the kind of the economic and the social side, and that's the bit that we have to get right. So we can't be building systems that are going to put people into fuel poverty. It has to be affordable to people, because otherwise they're just not going to connect, and then you will have failed. So that's the bit that we need to get right. And there has been there's legislation that's actually literally just come into force about consumer protection around heat networks, and that that wasn't there before. And there are some horror stories out there. There was an article in the Guardian last week giving some examples of people that have been on heat networks that have been locked into kind of very high tariffs. But those are, they were conflating two things, like district heating, which is what I'm really describing, where you've got pipes that are going across an entire town or city, is different to what gets referred to as communal heating, which is where you have an energy centre, but it's maybe serving one building or a few buildings that are clustered together. So you tend to find them in high density places like London. So the example that was given in the article was Greenwich. And those tend to be the source of heat for those is actually gas. They are heat networks, but they're burning gas, and that's why they're really expensive. So, you know, but there are now much stronger consumer protections, and that will be much, you know, so there's a lot more onus now on heat network operators to protect the end consumer. So, you know, I know a lot of people worry about monopolies and, you know, being locked into a single provider, but there is much stronger protection than there ever has been before around that now.
Okay, so let's move on to energy security. You I know have spoken about energy security out in the public before. It's something you're really passionate about. You've argued that it isn't just about producing more energy, but it's how you use and store heat. Can you unpack your thinking around that for us a little bit?
Yeah. So I wrote a LinkedIn article about this it was actually last Easter, because I specifically remember because my daughter was doing her hires, and she had like quite a stressful couple of weeks of doing her like higher art portfolio. And I thought, well, I'm going to sit down and invest some time in something in solidarity. So that's when I like worked on and wrote this article. And it was really around, I think there was a kind of a lot of noise at the time about, well, we should be drilling more in the North Sea, and energy security is effectively saying that energy security is equivalent to extracting more of our own oil and gas from the North Sea. And I actually, I studied geology at university. So it's not like, you know, I'm not going to like, I've not been a practicing geologist, but I understand, you know, like how it actually works, how the North Sea Basin came about and how it works. And so I thought, well, I feel that there's some perspectives here that really need to be challenged. So the first one is that the North Sea as a basin, like as a source of oil and gas, is in decline. So even, and that is just its geology. It is a mature basin. So although there's still oil and gas there, the fields are becoming harder to find and much more expensive. So it's going to cost much more money to get out to extract whatever is kind of like left in the basin. And even with new drilling, we are already a net importer of fossil fuels, a net importer of gas, and we would remain a net importer of gas even if we drilled more in the North Sea. Now, so that's the first thing. That is also on the assumption that anything that you extracted from the North Sea would be used in the UK. And that is also a fallacy, because it's a global market. So when you extract gas from the North Sea, it gets traded on a global market. So it doesn't actually matter whether it is North Sea gas or it's, you know, Texas shale gas or it's from the Middle East. They all get traded at the same price, and it doesn't, you know, we don't get to domestically use our gas. So it won't reduce anyone's bills. That's the important point to make there. And also, you know, even if it's getting more expensive to extract, it's definitely not going to reduce anyone's bills. And the third thing, and this is a bit that I think does get overlooked a lot, is that it's not just about immediate, you know, like gas coming out of wells and then immediately getting used. We do need to have energy storage as well. And for many years, our gas storage was in a big offshore facility off the coast of Yorkshire called Rough, which is owned by British Gas. And we used to store enough gas in Rough that could cover roughly half of our winter needs, like gas needs. But it has been kind of like run down and closed over the years, and now it's nowhere near that. So we don't have that buffer. Again, that whole thing about resilience, there's very little resilience in the system. So if something did happen to interrupt the supply, either coming from Norway or whatever, then we probably could quite easily find ourselves in a situation where it was an emergency and we didn't have enough gas to supply everybody's heating needs. And if it was if that happened at peak demand in winter. So, and at the same time as all of that, we are currently wasting a lot of our renewables because we can't move that electricity from where it's generated to where it's actually needed. So I think most of our electricity generation is off the coast of Scotland or the north of England, and the most of the demand is in the south of England. And at the moment, the grid is constrained, which is why we then have this situation of having to fire up gas-powered stations to provide that supply. And we pay those wind farm owners what's called curtailment payments. So if they have to turn off just because we can't use the electricity, they get compensated for that. And last year, those curtailment payments were around £1.5 billion. And, we could be and we should be using that electricity. So think large heat pumps are one way of using that curtailed wind. We could, and if we can't connect them through the grid because we don't have the capacity, then you can use things called private wire, which is literally that you connect your wind farm to the heat pump, which obviously means you're initially sort of using it locally, but you can, heat can be an off-taker for that electricity, but also when you're creating heat networks, you have what are called thermal stores, and a thermal store is basically, at its most basic, a big tank of water, and you can heat that water up, and then you store that energy as heat in the water for days or weeks. Whereas if you're storing electricity in a battery, at the moment we can only really do that for hours. So storing energy as heat is much more efficient than storing it as electricity.
Wow. I mean, it's just so interesting, isn't it? It's so far outside of anything that I've ever been taught about. So thank you for unpacking that. And is that why, in your opinion, heat networks and that sort of thermal storage just reduces the UK's exposure to the global volatility of energy prices?
Yeah. It provides you with flexibility. The storage, it's much smarter, it's more kind of decentralized, and it does introduce that, or it brings that resilience back into our system, which at the moment just isn't there.
Yeah, and gives us that energy security that we would love to have. Yeah. Okay, so if you had the opportunity and you were called into government to go and advise them, because this all sounds jolly sensible to me. Say you had a clean sheet, what would you prioritise around strengthening our energy security?
So I would decouple the electricity cost from gas, and and it's not, and obviously if it was that simple, people would have done it already. Yeah. But there is a lot of, like, we have there's a NESO, the National Energy System Operator, which came into existence 18 months ago. I mean, that's their remit, and they are looking at grid reform and electricity market reform. So that, there is work going on, but essentially heat still isn't really a high enough priority within that. And the reason for that is that what the government's Clean Power Plan 2030 plan is very heavily focused on generation, and upgrading the grid. And although those things are important, I think that heat needs to be much more front and centre in the conversations, and that that's those conversations need to kind of have more. So if I was in those rooms, I would just be constantly banging on about heat. That's what I would be doing.
And so you're not in those rooms, sadly.
No.
But what does keep you awake at night when, particularly when we're thinking about doing this responsibly? What worries you about scaling that low carbon heat solution in a responsible way?
So I think the first thing that I really worry about is that we scale it badly, that we sort of do it wrong in terms of trying to scale this, and that in doing so we do kind of create another generation of fuel poverty. So if we're rushing systems, or they're poorly designed, or they're not built with proper community engagement, then they'll be expensive to run and they'll be unreliable. And there is this is one of the areas where, although it's obviously good to have targets, if everybody is rushing to meet a 2030 target and we try and do everything at once when we should be doing things sequentially, there is a real risk of that. And the second thing that worries me is skills and the skills gap. So we just don't have the workforce to do this transition at scale. And it's not just about bringing new people in and training them, it's about losing experience at the other end. So, 1 in 5 of the kind of construction, not just in the energy sector, but in the construction sector generally, 1 in 5 workers are already over the age of 55 and likely to retire in the next 10 years. So there's it's not just about bringing young people in, it's like, who are they going to learn from if you lose all that skill and all that knowledge at the other end? And that is that's a real risk. But companies are only going to invest in training and skills and apprenticeships and things if there is a strong pipeline of work for them. And at the moment, it's still too up and down, and particularly for small companies. So, like actually across most sectors in the UK, but it's the same in construction. That the vast majority of companies are actually SMEs or micro businesses. And so for all of them, like Vital has it, we've got our own apprenticeship scheme. We had our largest ever intake of apprentices, 30 apprentices this year, and we're now at 15% of our workforce being aged 25 or under, and on a learn and earn pathway, and that's great. But really, what we need is for the 2,500 companies that are in our supply chain to be able to take on 1 or 2 apprentices, and that's where you're kind of really going to make that difference. It's just really, that's really, really hard right now, and we're just not going to have that talent pipeline without the project certainty and the economic certainty for people that are running those businesses. So, what I worry about is that we kind of get to 2030 and, we've got ambitious targets and we've got investors that have got money that they want to invest, but we don't have enough people on the ground, and we don't have enough projects that stack up from a kind of technical and economic point of view to allow that capital to be deployed, and we miss the opportunity.
Yeah. Wow, it's always so much more complex. Although it did put me in mind of, the whole conversation around, well, AI is going to take our jobs. Well, actually AI is going to generate some data centers. Those data centers are going to generate some heat, and actually we could be building a whole new, sector around that. That's just super interesting. Okay, so you spoke there about social impacts, and I know you grew up in an ex-coal mining community. How has that shaped the way you think about energy transition today?
Yeah. And actually, I don't know, probably a lot more than for a long time I realised even myself. But yeah, so I grew up in a village called Croy, which is in North Lanarkshire, which is a sort of area of Scotland just sort of to the north of Glasgow. So in the Central Belt, part of the Midland, the Midland Coal Valley. And I was a small child in the early 80s when the miner strikes were going on. And my own dad wasn't a miner, so we weren't kind of directly affected, but essentially it decimated the entire village. So he was one of very, very few people in the village that wasn't employed in the pits. And I was, you know, kind of like going to school with, I mean, I've got this, I remember one Christmas specifically, I suspect it was probably Christmas 1984 or 5, probably 85, I think, probably like into this kind of like first full year of the strikes. And my mum had said to me, so I've got a really big family and I've got lots of older cousins, and I'd been like handed down loads of Cindy stuff. So I had a big Cindy house and various other things, and I had 2 Cindy horses. And my mum said to me, "You need to give one of them away." And I was just like, "No, I'm not, not doing it." And she was like, "Yeah, into this bag." But that was because those things were going to kids that were in like my class at school. Like they were literally, I was in school with families that had no income for a year or more. Wow. And the village has never recovered. It has never recovered. And the area now, it's actually, as well as being a mining village, it's on the main railway line between Glasgow and Edinburgh. And it's like 10 minutes on the train from Glasgow and half an hour on the train from Edinburgh. So it's really well connected. And nowadays, lots and lots of houses have been built in the area and people have started to move in here. And it's actually quite affluent, but the village itself is still in the bottom 5% on the Scottish multiple indices of deprivation map. So you can see, even when there's been, you know, house building and you know, on the face of it, money coming in, that particular community has remained impoverished because of the effect of that industry being removed more than 40 years ago now. And that is why the whole idea of the just transition really matters to me. We cannot do that again. You know, those people were told that there would be new jobs, something would come in and replace coal, there would be other opportunities, and there weren't. For most of them, there weren't. And not just for them, but for their children, and in some cases now their grandchildren. So it's just untenable to me that we would go into this, another energy transition and create that. But the answer is not, and this was another thing that I got into a bit of a argy-bargy about on LinkedIn, the answer isn't to reopen coal mines like the Cumbria solution. You know, my grandfathers didn't want their grandchildren going down the pit. You know, that's the answer is, skilled jobs, recognising those jobs as being skilled and being paid and having career pathways within the new industries and that are being opened up by these opportunities.
So can you give us some examples then of where there's been improved outcomes in energy or infrastructure projects? And I'm thinking not only those communities that have been left behind, but, you know, equality, diversity and inclusion elements as well.
Mm-hmm. So specific project examples, you mean, of things where we've actually done a good...
been involved in,
So I think one example that I'm personally involved in at the moment is there's an organisation of 5 Scottish universities that have come together to work on the problem of how we decarbonise high density urban areas specifically. So UKRI, which is one of the UK's funding bodies, they had put out a call to universities all across the country to apply for funding to investigate this issue, because it's a huge part of how we get to net zero as a country. And it's a particular issue in Scotland because of the density of tenement buildings in Glasgow and Edinburgh and Aberdeen, and most Scottish cities. But we have lots of tenements. They are like really old and very difficult to decarbonise. So Edinburgh University, Glasgow, Strathclyde, Napier and the University of West of Scotland, they won the funding and they created an organisation called the Centre for Net Zero High Density Buildings. And it has 6 different working groups that are focusing on different elements of this. And I co-chair one of the working groups, which is focused on EDI training and skills. And one of our projects is working with an organisation called Powering Futures, and Powering Futures run a qualification for Scottish students who are in their 5th and 6th year at school. So that's like the equivalent of upper and lower 6th. And this qualification is if they pass it, they get the equivalent of a Scottish higher. So it counts towards their UCAS points and all this kind of stuff. But what they do is they work on a real world challenge that is set by a business. And there's 5 challenges that they get to choose from, and we set one around decarbonisation. So those students have been working on that project this year, and they will be presenting in a couple of weeks' time to various places across the country, to groups of business people who have volunteered to watch them and listen to the presentations. But through that, so that is a lot of the kids that end up doing that are probably, ones that are maybe not quite as academic. It gives them an opportunity to do a qualification that doesn't rely on passing an exam. It allows them to work on, on these like real world challenges, and to find out about businesses and jobs and careers that they would not otherwise have got to find out about. So I mentor a school, which is actually the school that my children go to, and my daughter's actually doing the qualification. But I go into the school and I sit with them and go through, give them some support. Recently, I've been helping them with their presentation skills, and they'll be doing their mock presentation to me in a couple of weeks before they do it for real. And so that programme, it's now in 125 schools across Scotland with around 2,500 students participating in it. And our hope, the reason that we've kind of invested in this as Vital, is that what we're hoping is that will generate a pipeline of young people that want to come forward and apply for our apprenticeship scheme, or if they do choose to go to university, that they do STEM subjects and then they come out looking for engineering degrees. So that is a really great example of where like business and academia, where we've come together and we've like really focused on a practical solution.
I love that. And the fact that you've got kids learning about this stuff from the ages of 16, 17,
16, 17.
Fantastic. Absolutely brilliant. All right, so coming out a little bit further as we sort of come to the end of our conversation, for leaders who are listening to this podcast who don't work in energy, I don't work in energy, this is all, I'm learning so much from you. But we do as leaders want to set ourselves net zero targets or ESG strategies. What's the one thing that you wish those leaders understood better about heat?
I think that it's understanding that you can't reach, if you've set yourself net zero targets, you can't reach them without thinking about heat. And it is quite difficult for business leaders because I worked in kind of in the commercial property side, that it's, you might own a building, but it's on a full repairing lease and therefore everything's up to your tenant, or conversely, you might be the tenant and it's up to your landlord and there's very little that you can do. But I think those, we need to find ways around that for those kind of like landlord-tenant relationships to work together on these things, because it's, you can't be thinking, well, we'll just do, that's too hard. And I think that's the thing. Because of that, it's like, well, we don't really need to think about it. That's really difficult. But what we can do is we can get, a green electricity on a green tariff, or we can make a commitment to changing our company car fleet to electric vehicles. No, that's great. Those things are great. But ultimately, what's going to happen is the closer you get to your net zero year, if you've not tackled heat, it's still going to be there. You're still going to have to do it, and it's just going to get more and more expensive. So what I would say is that, instead of just putting it in the too difficult box, start to think about it now, and just understand what your heat demand is. Understand what, find out information about your building. What can you control and what can't you, and look kind of like beyond your own walls. So are you in an area that has been, most local authorities in the whole country now will have done some kind of study to determine which parts of their regions are heat network zones. So are you in a heat network zone? Is a heat network going to be coming at some point in the future? And, can you plan for that? Can you look ahead to when you might be able to connect? And also to link heat to your social and your ESG goals. So thinking about, that like about the local jobs and apprenticeships and things like that. And just being realistic in terms of, obviously within the confines of what everybody can do. And I know a lot of people will be thinking, I can't do anything, but if you've questioned it and then you've started to ask questions about it and you've done that work and you're trying to find out, get that information, then you might actually be able to make things happen. Because one of the biggest issues that we have is if you're trying to kind of demonstrate that a heat network is economically viable, you need off-takers, you need customers. And if no one's aware and no one's, thinking about it, then if they're asked, do you want to connect to a heat network, they might be like, well, no, probably not. That just sounds like a hassle. But if you've already, if you have educated yourself and you have got that awareness, then, if you're actually approaching your local authority or whoever is going to be leading a heat network in your area, and saying, well, actually, we would be interested, then that in itself can make a difference. So we're in a joint venture at the moment with another company called Chemical to develop the UK's first advanced heat network area zone, and it's in London. So it's called SWAN, South Westminster Area Network. So that's one live example, and there will be others that will be coming forward, and in the next few months, because there's lots of local authorities that are looking at this.
And you wouldn't necessarily know that you're in a heat district.
No, you wouldn't know unless you went to find that information for yourself. No one is going to come and tell you. Not right now, unless, somebody comes knocking on your door, like Chemical or one of our other partners, Enervate, like where we are active in some cities, we might have, there might be partners that are actually going out and speaking to certain, identifying people that they think would be, large heat users, and saying, would you consider it, would you, sign a letter of understanding, a memorandum of understanding about connecting, or a letter of intent about connecting to a heat network. But generally, it's not something that will be, said that all the local authorities have done these studies, and on their websites, there will be a report that says, well, we've looked at where potential heat sources are, we've looked at density of population, and we've actually put lines around areas that we think are likely to be future heat network zones. And anybody can go and try and find that information and see whether they're in one of those zones or not. But, no one's going to come and tell you that information.
Yeah, so there's an action we can all take and find out whether we're in a heat network area. I will be going to go and do that. It's funny, every time I have one of these conversations with somebody who's heavily involved in sustainability and responsible business, one of the things that comes out really, really strongly is sometimes the most effective thing you can actually do, it's cheap and it's, it's free, is to ask better questions, just asking better questions. And hopefully what this podcast is doing is giving people those questions to ask. So on that note, let me ask you my next question around if you had the power to change one assumption that dominates the UK's approach to decarbonisation, what would it be?
It would be the assumption that that generation is the primary lever of change. So, what I mean is that everything's focused on more generation, like more wind farms and more solar, and that, because basically the current model is assuming that we have to build sufficient generation to meet peak demand, and obviously that is important, but shifting towards that holistic energy system approach where heat plays a proper role introduces the resilience that I talked about earlier on, and actually means that, if you're integrating power and heating and cooling, instead of treating them all as separate silos, then you can move away from a fossil fuel network without having to have, that before you've got to that kind of like peak demand situation, and potentially make the overall cost of the transition less. So that would be the one thing that I would do.
Brilliant. All right, and let's look towards the future and a bit of hope. What genuinely gives you hope that we can do this transition well?
So I think the first thing is that we already have the technology. So, you know, we're not relying, you know, it's not like carbon capture. We're not saying there'll be some silver bullet that'll come in the future. This works. We know it works. It's been done lots of times, so we know we can do it. So that's the first thing, and you know, and that we've seen it working in practice. I mean, we've got, you know, we know examples of where, you know, people's bills have reduced massively and carbon emissions have dropped off by 70 to 80%. So we've already got those case studies. We know that it works. And the second thing is that, you know, it's around young people. So all the young people that I engage with, whether it's ones that are still in school through Power and Futures or our apprentices and our graduates, they get it. You know, they understand why this matters, and they're not really interested in, you know, the ones that I have met anyway, there's a lot of them, in kind of like arguing about or being cynical about climate. They just want to be part of the solution and to get on to crack on with it. And then the third thing, and I think although this might sound counterintuitive, it's what gives me hope is actually the failures, because we have tried some things that have not worked, and that from every one of those you learn, and we know, you know, so we can see what not to do, and that should mean that if where we go from this point is much better informed and will work better for ordinary people, and not, you know, not just for a small few that are kind of, you know, at the top of the chain. So yeah, those would be my three, because I'm quite an optimistic person, Philippa. So I'm like, you know, like I do genuinely believe that it will, you know, that it will work, and that is those three things are fundamental to that.
All right, we're just going to finish off with a slightly lighter-hearted quick fire round. All right, what's your favourite way to switch off after an ESG heavy day?
I love a good crime drama. So, and like crime novels as well. But yeah, so I've been watching a few things recently. So I watched a series called Black Shore, which was very good. About an Irish detective, and then another Irish one which is called How to Get to Heaven from Belfast, which is by Lisa McGee, who did Derry Girls. So this is her follow up to that, and that was very funny. I'd recommend both of them.
Excellent. And I am a massive bibliophile. What's your the best book you've read in the last year?
Was actually a book that I reread. I first read it in 2018, around Brexit time. I can't remember, but it's called Travellers in the Third Reich, by a woman called Julia Boyd. And she was a her husband was a diplomat, and was posted in Germany, and she lived in Germany. And the book is about real people, stories from real people who travelled in Germany in the 20s and 30s. And essentially it kind of gives a picture of the rise of the Nazis through the stories that these people tell. And that there are, you know, it's a really interesting book, and there's a lot, you know, the stories come from like a huge range of people, but it does give you something, you know, that you can root it in the current day, in terms of thinking about, well, how did this happen? How did that an entire country? And I think, you know, one of the things is it makes it really clear that there was nothing exceptional about Germany. You know, what happened there could happen anywhere, but also just some of the individual stories. So one that really kind of like stuck with me, and actually was the part of the reason that I reread the book, was because I was thinking about it. I thought, I'm going to go back and read that again. It was about two old English ladies who were sisters, and they loved opera, and they would travel to Germany to see the opera, and they would go with like hardly any, you know, the very little luggage and like bare minimum, and then they would come back a different way. But when they came back, they would be wearing furs and loads of jewellery and things like that, and they were basically smuggling out the belongings of Jewish people who weren't able to get their own like valuables and things out of Germany. But it was the little details of things, like one of them didn't have pierced ears, so she had to wear clip-on earrings, make sure she only ever had clip-on earrings, because if she had, you know, like pierced jewellery, then they would realise that they weren't hers. And it's just, right, you know, the fact that people did things like that and had to do things like that. So so I would recommend that. It's a very, it's you know, it tells a really important story, I think, but is not a heavy read.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to add that to my list. One word that people use to describe you?
Scottish. But also, well, pragmatic. I think people, you know, I think I do get, you know, if people, the one thing that they would say to my face anyway is that I'm a doer, so I can't get mucked.
There are definitely worse things.
Yeah.
And what do you think is the most misunderstood phrase in sustainability?
I think it's net zero. And I think it's misunderstood and misaligned and misappropriated. But I mean, all it really means is you are taking, you know, whatever you're adding, you're taking the same out. And it doesn't mean absolute zero. And I think that gets kind of, you know, it means that you're essentially, we've kind of like, if you're going to get really technical about it, we've got the Paris, you know, at the Paris Agreement, it said this is the levels we need to be at 2050. So whatever is still in the system at that time, we have to be able to take stuff out and balance that. And it's about balance. And I think, you know, the net bit does do a lot of heavy lifting. So on the one hand, I think a lot of companies, particularly around 2019, you know, I've set, when there were kind of various declarations of climate emergencies and things, a lot of people set net zero targets without understanding how they were going to get to them. And then once they started doing the work of how they were going to get to them, thinking, oh, well, that's actually going to be really expensive, or it might even be impossible. And then they start quietly abandoning the targets. And I don't, you know, instead of doing that, I think it's better to own it and say, yeah, actually, we said this. And there's been examples of companies that have done this really well, but saying, actually, you know, we said that, but we didn't really understand it. But now we've done all this work, and now we do understand it. And these are the things that we're doing that are going to make a difference. But do you know what? That original number that we gave, we're not going to be able to do that. So that's, you know, kind of like one side, not allowing it to, like, you just push things, you know, kick that can down the road, really. And then on the other side, you know, the fact that the kind of scaremongering of trying to say that it's basically saying that we have to go back to, like, you know, living in caves and like doing everything by candlelight. That's obviously not true either. And the whole point of the net is that you can continue with some emissions as long as you're offsetting them. So as long as we're honest about those trade-offs that we have to make. And I think a lot of that nuance just gets completely lost, because it just gets thrown out as a phrase all the time, and people have, you know, they just say it and they don't really think about it anymore.
Thank you. And I have learnt so much. And, you know, secretly and selfishly, I do these podcasts so I can learn from amazing people like you. I mean, I had no idea that heat was such a huge part of that sustainability, the environmental approach that we're taking across the UK. As you described it, that sort of invisible giant. I didn't know. I still don't know currently whether we are on a heat network, but I am definitely going to go and find out. And as always, you've brought to the fore. Let's go and ask some really good questions. Let's dig into the detail of what it is we think we know, and just double check whether or not that is the absolute truth. And you've really shone a light for us on the role of heat and how much more work that we have to do around it, and actually you've made me feel really very optimistic about the possibility that we can. So thank you, Anne. I really appreciate your time. And if you, my listeners, have enjoyed this conversation, please tell your friends about it. Tune in for our next podcast. And as always, keep asking good questions. Thank you so much.